Explorer Captain James Cook claimed Australia for Britain when he encountered it on April 19, 1770, during his first Pacific voyage, but it really begins in the cold dawn of the 26th of January 1788. This is when 11 weather-worn ships of the fleet, under the command of Arthur Phillip, arrive at what we now call Sydney Cove. But at that moment, for those aboard, this place is remote, strange, and full of hope and fear. They plant the British flag, claiming the land for New South Wales and for the British Crown. And so this moment marks the beginning of a dramatic transformation, of a land long inhabited by indigenous peoples, of a fledgling empire still reeling from the loss of its American colonies, and of a story that will stretch over 100 years. But why did Britain turn south, into the great unknown of the Southern Ocean? On one level, the answer is practical. After the American War of Independence, the British Empire lost its North American convict outlets, and its prisons in England were overflowing. They needed somewhere to send convicts, somewhere remote, somewhere they could build a foothold. But you have to remember that the majority of people were in jail awaiting trial, or were imprisoned because of debts they could not pay, and you could be sentenced to death just for stealing a silk handkerchief, so it wasn't hard to be branded a convict. Other factors such as the Industrial Revolution and the enclosure movement or privatization of land in England meant that the only options for many poor people was emigration, or to work as tenant farmers for landowners, or move to crowded cities to compete for low-wage jobs, and these economic stresses likely led to an increase in crime, such as theft and prostitution, as individuals and families struggled to fend off starvation. On another level, it was about empire. The map of the world was changing, Europe's great powers were competing in the Pacific, and the British government sought strategic advantage. Science and commerce counted too. Botanists like Joseph Banks were already championing the colonial potential of the land, a land that would eventually be known as Down Under. Almost immediately, the new settlement confronted its own fragility. The soils were unfamiliar, the climate harsh, and supply ships were unpredictable. And in those early years, the colony teetered on starvation. Governor Phillip famously wrote home that he would not wish convicts to lay the foundations of an empire, an admission of how raw the situation was. Convict labour became the backbone of colonial Britain's strategy here. Between 1788 and 1868, around 162,000 convicts were transported to the Australian colonies. Their stories are often brutal and little told. Men and women uprooted, sent thousands of miles, many not returning. Yet these convicts would build the early roads, clear the land, and establish the farms that would feed a colony. But the land they occupied was not empty. The continent had been home for tens of thousands of years to indigenous Aboriginal Australians, but the arrival of British colonialism brought dispossession, disease, conflict, and cultural disruption. The doctrine of terra nullius, the notion that land belonged to no one, was applied by British governors to justify claiming ownership of vast territories without treaties or formal agreements. In this way, the story of British colonialism in Australia is one of duality: immense opportunity for the settlers and immense cost for the indigenous peoples. As the decades rolled on, the colony grew. Free settlers arrived. Freed convicts started businesses, farms expanded, sheep and cattle moved outwards. By the 1820s and 1830s, colonists were pushing ever further into the continent's interior, grazing in lands far from the coastal settlements. Meanwhile, from the British government's standpoint, governance matured. By the 1850s, Acts of Parliament created elected legislative councils in the colonies, and a move from direct rule to responsible government began. One of the lesser-known dramatic moments is the so-called Rum Rebellion in 1808. In the colony of New South Wales, the officers of the New South Wales Corps, who had formed monopolies in trade, especially the rum trade, rose against Governor William Bligh. Yes, the same one from the Bounty story. They deposed him in a coup. It was the only successful armed takeover of government in Australian history. That uprising tells us something. Colonial society, even as it was being built, was divided with conflict between convicts and free settlers, between military elites and governors, between ambition and the relentless struggle of trying to build in a remote land. By the 1850s, change accelerated. The discovery of gold in places like Victoria triggered influxes of population, wealth, and social change. The colonial economy grew rapidly. Wool, agriculture, mining, and entire cities emerged from humble convict outposts. At the same time, the balance of power shifted, and the settlers demanded a representative government and local decision-making. Then, in 1901, 6 colonies united to form the Commonwealth of Australia, a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. But beneath the facade of prosperity and empire, there were tensions, contradictions, and legacy issues. There was the expansion of pastoralism and mining, which pushed indigenous peoples off their lands, and sometimes violently. Conflict on the frontier left scars rarely acknowledged in earlier histories. For example, in 1835, there was the proclamation of Governor Burke, which reinforced the idea that Aboriginal peoples had no title to land, and that the Crown held beneficial ownership from the date of settlement. The irony is stark. A colony built on convict labor, the clearing of land and remote hardship now became one of the wealthiest parts of the world, yet some of the very foundations, such as law, of justice, of recognition of indigenous rights, were shaky. Let us pause for a moment on the convict dimension, because it offers a startling contrast to the usual grand narratives of empire. Many of those sent to Australia were not the political exiles of drama or royalty, but thieves, petty criminals, unemployed labourers from industrialising Britain. One historian estimated 2/3 of transported convicts were thieves from working-class towns. And yet some of them became pivotal in colonial society. Emancipated convicts who became farmers, artisans, even politicians. The raw social mobility, seldom possible in Britain, suddenly became possible in Australia. The penal colony that was once a place of punishment turned, paradoxically, into a place of new beginnings for many people. This contradiction lies at the heart of Australia's colonial story because it was both a land of punishment and a land of opportunity, a place where lives were controlled and yet transformed. Here, the British Empire's reach met the raw edge of the frontier, and from that clash a new society began to take shape, albeit with the cultural imprint of British colonialism. British institutions of law and government were transplanted almost wholesale: courts, parliaments, and local government. Then there is the English language, British migration patterns, architecture, even landscape design, such as parks, public buildings, each followed the mother country's model. At the same time, the geography, climate, and indigenous presence forced adaptation. Settlers had to grapple with droughts, unfamiliar soils, and isolation from Britain. This new Australian society also formed distinctive cultures, such as the bush ethos. They took pride in their convict legacy, and the idea of egalitarianism was emerging out of the pioneering hardship they endured. In other words, the Australian identity that emerged was rooted in British foundations, yet uniquely shaped by the land and its history of colonisation. In a way, Australia was the empire's second chance. After setbacks in North America, this was a region where Britain believed it could build anew, albeit not entirely without cost or controversy. And what of the Indigenous perspective? The impact on Indigenous Australians was immense. Prior to colonisation, the continent was home to perhaps around 750,000 Indigenous people, belonging to more than 500 distinct groups. But the arrival of British settlers, and the doctrine that land was essentially empty land, it rendered those occupants invisible in law. Land was taken for grazing, farming, and mining. Consequently, Indigenous peoples lost traditional hunting grounds, water rights, sacred sites, and the arrival of new diseases decimated communities. And conflict erupted on the frontier, sometimes overtly violent, sometimes through dispossession and the erosion of culture. Many Indigenous Australians resisted, adapted, and fought. Others tried to survive within the colonial system, taking on labour, missions, Christianity, yet suffering deeply. British colonialism in Australia forged a new piece of the British Empire and helped create the nation of Australia, but it did so at immense human cost. The convicts who arrived became settlers, the settlers became citizens, the colony became a nation, and yet the Indigenous Australians who had lived on the land for millennia entered a story not of their choosing. Today, Australia remains deeply shaped by British colonialism with its laws, language, and institutions, but it has also developed its own character, and since its independence in 1901, it is a country that has grown from strength to strength. If you've enjoyed this documentary and love stories of the past, enjoy relevant visuals, and appreciate history documentaries, don't forget to like and subscribe to Obscura Historia today.